Welcome and thank you for joining us today on Esoteric Radio. Today is Sunday, February 13, 2011. I'm your co-host today. My name is Satori Moon. This is going to be the first of many great series that Sevan will be putting out to reveal everything that needs to be told. So for those who are ready, the time has come. The title of today's show is No More Secrets, Series 1, The Introduction. And before I get to Sevan to unleash his knowledge, I want to just give out the number to call for the show. The number is 347-996-5688. Again, 347-996-5688. And please press 1 to put your hand up in order for me to take your call on switchboard if you have any questions to ask. Furthermore, you can post your questions on Blog Talk Radio's chat box and, of course, the Resistance chat box for the members of the Resistance. And for those that are new to the Resistance, you can get more information by checking out the website at www.resistance2010.com. And there you'll find a free copy and be able to download Sevan's book, The Code to the Matrix, which is highly recommended for those who need to be in the know. Now I'm going to pass it on to Sevan, who's going to reveal this hidden knowledge. No more secrets. Right, Sevan?
That's right. Good day to everyone at the Resistance and also guests today. We wanted to thank everyone for showing up and actually making themselves available to expand their consciousness. And today's show is scheduled for an hour and a half, so we'll get right into it. I can definitely say today's show is one of the only shows that I actually had to study for, I would say, because the knowledge itself is so vast. Basically, within the last 2 weeks, I've been after the alien interview, and I guess we'll kind of start there because there's a few things I wanted to say about that very briefly, because I've gotten a couple emails about people questioning the authenticity of the alien interview in conjunction with the situation that went on in Roswell. But the fact of the matter is what I began to realize when reading the alien interview is that what I was actually listening to was not necessarily an alien at Roswell, but an actual alien inside of a human body, which is the case with many of the individuals on this planet. And that person choosing to reveal the information in a certain kind of way in order for more people to latch a hold of that information and to even ingest it. Because the alien and UFO phenomena is a lot bigger than people just saying, hey, I have a lot of intelligence and I want to share it with you because I've been able to obtain that from my universal origin. But the fact is that what you have to understand also is with the Montauk projects and the Roswell incident, that the government does not stop individuals from saying that they were involved in those projects because those projects are still classified in most degrees, except for the continuous disinformation that continues. So people have to understand that there's still a large amount of people that are saying that they were involved in these type of projects, but that, if you look 30 years ago, was nothing because there were a lot of people saying and doing that. So I believe the alien interview is a person that has obtained higher knowledge through connection studies or through various channels and has come to reveal that knowledge to us. So where we go from here is this. What I did personally is I accepted that knowledge as being the knowledge that was what I needed to ingest, because I have a personal outlook on higher levels of knowledge. I look at it as a weight that when you're able to lift it, it makes you stronger. And I often challenge my mind with this type of knowledge in order to at least put it in there and allow it to see if it can mix with other things and then see what the outcome will be. It's basically like more or less an experiment within the mind being contained within the mind. And many people have to understand that they're ingesting and carry so much knowledge, but that knowledge is contained in separate compartments. Or else if it mixed together like alchemy with other things, then it would just blow up. And some people feel that blowing up in the instability at times that they feel with what they're exactly facing in the environment. And so what we mainly want to do is we want to get to the answers to a lot of the questions. And, of course, that is the general mission of the Resistance and myself is, of course, the EverQuest, or documenting the EverQuest of my ascent out of the planet into other spheres and into universalism. And so what that's led to, of course, is a different approach at our way of teaching and understanding, or understanding as we call it, which is basically a person is along on the mission and often inputs on the website what they're experiencing in order for us to run it through our cipher, as we call it, which is our ability to be able to look at things for their in-depth meaning through Kabbalistic values, through synchronistic situations that have happened throughout the dimension. So basically, where we're at now is that we have to get to the point where we conclude our study on this format, meaning that the format that we're using to study is still going to be somewhat partial or biased because it's not in some type of universal format. It's in a particular language. And so this language has kept us in more or less a cave. And I will give brief words to the caveman mentality. The caveman mentality is perceiving that all of what's around you in your immediate line of sight or in your immediate experience is the only thing that exists. And what this causes is a regression in the mind state of the Homo sapien to go back into its preliminary phase. And now many are questioning whether that preliminary phase was our higher state of thought, meaning when we were primitive, did we think better? And so we're going to get to the answers to those questions in this series. And most people are generally familiar with our format. We generally do live stream, and we generally have a post that goes in conjunction with the show. But today I felt it was most necessary that everyone just kind of tune out of everything that was going on in their environment or that could distract their motor skills and to just focus really on what's being said, because this is more or less the introduction to the completion of my knowledge on this planetary system and discovering enough of what's going on to get the point of what exactly I need to do. And so what that is about is that's about, well, just a brief second. Okay, I do apologize for that. I just had to do a brief sound test here. So basically what this is about is that this is about, like I said, coming to the conclusion of this knowledge on this format. And I felt the only way to do that was to go as far back as I could in my knowledge to what happened first, so I can start there. In fact, that's why I haven't released a second book, is because I want the second book to also be the final book. I'm not trying to take people into a long series of books. I really want to conclude this whole thing. But I started to realize as I began to go down the rabbit hole and the foxhole and every single other hole that the knowledge was getting so expansive that in order to continue beyond the knowledge, I was going to have to use a different format, and that's when ideas of the universal language came across. But what I will share is so everyone can also graduate to that point at the same time, so they're very clear about what I'm talking about, especially in the future. What needed to happen was we needed to create a series, and this series, I believe, is going to have 9 parts to it. A 9-part series that allows you to basically approach anyone's personality with the knowledge from the angle that they generally are using, meaning that people are rolled up into an Enneagram generally when they're behaving like clones. Eating clone things, and as they say, that you are what you eat. And what that ends up causing is, over time, it causes a dulling of the senses. And so there are many people who have their senses dulled, and in effect, they're dead, for better lack of words. And so the knowledge that actually came to this dimension a long time ago was how to raise the dead. And if people have forgotten about that and wanted to cover all of that up. But the idea is that if a person's in a theta state, or a state that is really likened unto death, then they can be awakened from that state. And what's happened now is the need, because we're now in what's called a community, or more or less a collective. That's just how humanity, what one person does ends up affecting another person, even if it's in the long run, because it's like a ripple each of us cause when we make decisions and make actions. They ripple out through the whole universe. And so what happens is that it forces many of us that have gotten into these high levels of knowledge to actually come and reach back down the ladder and to pick up the individuals that are coming up that ladder. And that concept, I'll use the word, that concept is now starting to spread, meaning that people are starting to see that it's going to be better off for everyone if we get the whole species and all of the species to the highest level possible of their knowledge so that we can make this transition to a more effortless dimension. And I'll explain this effortless dimension. Basically, what you're looking at on this dimension is that everyone here is more or less a plant. And their plant produces fruit. And these beings that are on the vibratory frequency higher than us come and pick that fruit. And in turn, they use that fruit to feed themselves to generate, guess what, more fruit. And then something comes and takes it from them. So this is basically like a bee, lighting onto a flower, collecting the pollen, and then flying off. And it has to suffer none of the struggles of the flower growing and needing water and maybe being stepped on, all this. It just can get the pollen. While the bee still has to take this pollen, has to go into flight and to take this pollen into another place and to pollinate in order for other things to continue to flourish. So when it brings this pollen to whatever it's bringing, whatever is receiving that pollen didn't have to do anything to go and get that pollen, so the bee had to do more work. But what it continues to produce, and so what you can see is a cycle here of production, collection, planting, harvesting. And what I realized is that on the higher levels, you became more potent because of the knowledge that you obtain on the lower levels, and you become basically more, it's like the solution to energy, which is to put a small amount of input for a large amount of output. And so this is what happens on the higher levels. You become more smoother with how you put out your energy, and you can gain and keep a lot more of your energy in order to tap into the higher levels of consciousness. Because where are the higher levels of consciousness? They're in different spaces, and those spaces need to be traveled to. There would be distance, there would be time, there would be energy. And all these exponents which we've now discovered, which we can't just throw them all in the trash as if they don't exist, because they give us the integers that we need to be able to explain what exactly we're experiencing. And the reason why we want to be able to explain what we're experiencing is because we have to pass that on to our next generation in order for them to grow, and they will take it to another level. And so this is, and we'll continuously live through them because we're all a frequency. And so this is stuff that started to be discovered by the faction, the resistance. It's facts. Like we saw it in the fractal, we saw it in different areas of life. But there were still, of course, a lot of questions. And so what this series is really about is actually answering all the questions on the planet. People are going to say, okay, is Sevan going to attempt to answer all the questions on this planet? All the important ones from my standpoint. And my standpoint, as a chart that I actually have here on this post that I'm actually going to probably go live about Tuesday, but it's going to show you a standpoint in which I use as a meditation that takes me out of the planet and allows me to view the planet through more or less a looking glass, as they like to give this term, meaning like a actual, how you would look down into a microscope and you would see the life in there. And then you can decide where you want to interject and where you could be the most effective, just as someone who knows who studies things under microscopes know exactly when to inject certain types of aminos and different types of chemicals in order to get the process that they need to happen. So we need to understand that because we're capable of doing that now, then there's always been beings that have been capable of manufacturing and engineering things to the highest degrees. So we have to talk really briefly about the language and a word to the language, which is what we've discovered a while ago to be tampered with in a way in which it releases a large amount of our energy to higher beings. Now, again, when we say higher beings, we're just talking about beings that are moving on a higher vibratory frequency, spinning faster, for better lack of words. You see on the Earth, you should see how fast the Earth is spinning compared to other stars and other celestial bodies. So what we have is when we examine the language, what we find is the language is basically a slave language. And this is very interesting to understand, because I was thinking while in a meditation about the movie The Mummy. And in that movie, when the mummy actually grabbed a person that he was the only one there that spoke Hebrew, and he started to basically say his last words in Hebrew, and then the mummy picked up on it and said, "Oh, you speak the language of the slaves. Bring him with us." And so what this is about, as I was beginning to ponder that, I realized, of course, as we've all realized, that God's names are all in the language, that what that sounds like to the gods is, thank you, I praise you, I love you, I care for you, I'm going to do this for you today. And meaning, in your language, and then how you think it's coming out is you're just talking. You're just having your normal conversation during the day. And so just like all those words that I just said are the names of actual deities. So how it sounds to them is you're just continuing to give them reverence and thank you. And so what this has caused is it's caused a mismanagement of energy on the third dimension. It's actually a fractal that we can see where our energy that we're using is way out of whack. We're pumping this gas and, the money and it's the expense and the misuse of funds, and all this stuff is showing us the fractal of the misuse of energy, which is also the fractal of the misuse of the humans. Their energy is being misused and not used properly because they could actually charge up to such a high degree, but they're not being allowed to do that for certain reasons, which we're going to talk about, and then we're also going to talk about why it's inevitable that those reasons are removed, meaning that it's actually inevitable for everyone on this planet to go into the higher state of consciousness, and that's just something that cannot be prevented. It could be slowed down in time. As we talked about, the planet is a prison planet by the words planned net, and the word prison, which means pre-Zion, which means Zionist agenda, and when you're in prison, you're given time, and we're doing time like convicts. And to understand the actual meanings of these words makes one understand how to unravel the words, because the words are spells. And unfortunately, what you're looking at in this reality, and the reason why it's so unbalanced, especially with the event of the Catholic Church, is because the Catholic Church was actually attempting to solve a situation, and no one can even understand which one was better at this point, where people were misusing the knowledge that is now trickling itself back into society, meaning this knowledge of the herbs and the knowledge of the crystals and the knowledge of all the things on this planet that are powerful. It's coming back into people's hands slowly but surely. And the test, again, remains as if we're going to use the knowledge to give people the fortune or the energy, or are we going to use it to curse them? And, of course, we've seen the latest trend, which is being showed throughout the Hollywood, which are the as-below resonators of what's going on above, meaning the hell version of what's happening in the sky. You're seeing where they're gravitating and taking the frequency too. But just as the earth is an ark and an ark is a boat is controlled by a very small piece in the back. And so that means that in consciousness, that a small group of people can actually change the whole direction of the dimension. It's guaranteed. So what happens is that the first thing is I wanted to let everyone know that we're going to be talking about some very serious matters. It's the boy to man, girl to woman conversation, the real one, the real birds and the bees and what that really means. And what this is going to do is after the person is done, they're going to have no choice but to grow up. Now, it comes in just the right time because the planet is actually on the level of where it needs to go through a cleansing cycle again. And for people who don't think the planet deserves a cleansing cycle, they need to think again, because the planet is a living being and has already been disturbed by the previous cycle that's just happened with a being that we call Ra, who's Marduk, who's Zeus, who's Jupiter, who's Jesus. And what we'll show is the connection between all these names in the etymology and also the prophecies that speak of this, that the people that worship these beings believe into the T, and this makes up the greater portion of the individuals that live on the planet, meaning that generally this conversation people need to understand is not directed towards them as resistance members and people who have studied, because I'm basically just filling in more of the blanks for you. But that's so that you can go and explain that to other individuals, because that is going to be necessary for you to have all of the questions answered when they approach you, because you don't know what they're going to ask you. So I'm going to take a look briefly here at a list that I have here, and this list is going to give me a few reference points to what exactly I need to talk about, because, again, the conversation is so expansive. Always remember, you can come back and listen to this show again, but I have a tendency to jump around through things, but I want to stay really more on topic. I wanted to talk about, there's another fact about our fathers are often our conquerors. And I'll say that one more time. Our fathers are often our conquerors. This is a fact that I started to look at when I began to go into this tree of how things are set up in the mind. It's set up exactly on the Fibonacci sequence, is the tree of thought for a person, at least when they begin thought. And what happens is that I started to notice that if there was wars and continuous wars, which are going on now and can't be denied going throughout history, that in the event that one person wins, generally those soldiers move into the villages, and most of the men there have already been conquered once in the battle, or are just going to be at the most slaves or prisoners, but generally killed. And then the only thing that remains is the women and the children, which are male and female, women and children. And then generally the soldiers or the king or someone in that retinue begin to blend with those women, and then they make babies. And then that next baby that comes out, his father is actually his mother's conqueror. And that's by fact. So what happens when this occurs is that people get very confused about who is the enemy, especially when they start looking in their family lineages. So I would like people to sit and ponder that for a while when they start to think about who they want to send their hate to these days. Because people also have to understand that there is, like, if you're Polish and then someone else is Irish and then another person is British, these groups of people still come from different parts. And so what I'm saying is that just because a person is the same color as another person doesn't make them from the same place. And so we have to understand that there are times that some of the Khans who were darker skin tone went into areas that were also of darker skin tone people and mated with those people and caused still a darker skin tone child. And this also is vice versa, a lighter skin tone child. But the story still remains, the conqueror was the father. So understanding that opens up this vast world of spirituality that has puzzled so many for so long. And it begins with this being that we call the Father God. And it becomes very interesting because whatever people personally believe in, especially when you're a very small percentage, does really matter for you. But in retrospect, if you're trying to change the whole environment, you need to know what everyone's believing in. And so that's something that I always find that most people that teach or learn esoteric knowledge seem to forget about, is that we have to understand that this knowledge is for the people who are still in these systems. And so you have to understand how it's exactly wired together before you could ever think about pulling it apart on a massive scale, and then transitioning people to exactly what they need to be, where they need to be, because that's also what's equally as important. Because this is what I started to realize also as I began to sit in these deeper meditations and on the information and on what I had learned thus far, is what we've discovered now, especially with the dollar bill being the mark of the beast and all of these different things about how the United States was formed and it really being the new world, and, of course, Britain and their Merovingian connections, and China and the dragons and Inanna fleeing to those countries to populate, and the Hindus worshiping the Aryans that fell from the sky. And what we've learned out of all of this is a few things, but one thing really remains important, which is how exactly do we expect to go on from here if we cannot personally come to terms with any of this information? If people keep choosing sides, then it will continue. And so my main goal now is to become more biased with the information, to become more unbiased with the information. And the reason is because of the bias causing a major block in understanding and understanding, overstanding, and all the rest of them, outerstanding. What I began to understand is that there was different points that you had to be on in your perspective in order to gain the complete knowledge of what was going on here. And if you stayed at any point for too long, you had failed yourself, because it's moving and it requires you to continuously move with it. And so I wanted to get into a couple things, but what I wanted to do first is I wanted to take a brief moment to refresh myself for a moment so I can gather my train of thought, grab a drink of water here. And I'm also going to have Satori give out the telephone numbers to the show for anyone that wants to call in or just to listen or ask questions, and also to instruct people about the chat box and if they want to ask questions. So I'm going to put the line on a brief mute here.
Okay, go ahead, Sevan. And, the numbers again are 347-996-5688. And that's for the Esoteric Radio Blog Talk Radio Show. The number is 347-996-5688. And if you want to ask a question, just press 1 on your phone, and I'll be able to see that your hand's up, and you can ask a question if we get a chance to get to your questions. And you can also post your question on Blog Talk Radio, Esoteric Radio chat box. And if you're a member of the Resistance, you can put it on the Resistance chat box, and I have my eye on both those chat boxes. And just going to wait a moment for Sevan to take a moment, and then we'll get back to the show.
Okay, and forward. Okay, so what I wanted to, so I'm going to go ahead and start talking about this series and this introduction and what's going to be uncovered. Of course, the first show or the first segment was they came from the sea, which I felt personally was a level that we needed to start at, because there were instructors that were already here explaining what had happened the previous cycle to man. And man had gotten very fond of those instructors and erected those instructors as gods. And because those gods came from the sea, which is not just the physical ocean that we know of, but also space, they were, after that point, the symbol of the fish became their symbol. But there's a time that went on before that. Actually, we were going to even go back further than that, which was we're going to go into deep space, meaning the actual point where things begin, the 0 point of the fractal where it opens up, and then the 0 point of when it closes. So what we find is that very close to the 0 point of our existence here, you have a planet that is spinning 360 degrees, completely covered with water, and inside of this water, which is more like a plasmic field, more than the water that we actually know of, but more of the same type of fluid that you would see within a woman's stomach when the baby is in the womb. This kind of, I think it's called amniotic fluid, or amniotic fluid. So this type of fluid is what we're talking about. And what you had living in that was all the preliminary phases of all of existence that you see right now, just about. All the animals and the mixture of the human body is, of course, that of an animal. And then the soul having its star origin or its heavenly origin. And so what we'll find is in that primordial soup that it wasn't as microscopic as it's made to seem, that in that soup is actually all of the beings that exist in different combinations. And so what I think that we'll find ultimately with mythology is that it's possible that we can pull back off of the story of mythology and see it all under a microscope and in the process of actually how life works. But because we're on a material plane, this is actually played out at some point with different beings that resonate the energies of what we're speaking of. And so in this primordial soup, what you had is a place called Tiamat, which was situated somewhere between Jupiter and Mars. And in this particular planet,
they say that what was happening is that there was basically just a cultivating of these type of beings, which are now known to us as the reptilians. And the reason why I use that term is because the reptilian species, the lowest of the reptilian species is actually the serpent. And even below that is, well, actually it's not even the lowest. There's still a worm that is below that. So basically the genealogy of the reptilian species is very vast. So it often fills up our a large part of our incubation phase, like when you look under the microscope or you see the worms that exist all over the place. You start to understand that this worm tube-like thing is the beginning of stuff. And so you can imagine when that is collected to a point where it's still conscious. And so this is the part of how to understand the knowledge from this point, because you have to understand anything that happens after that is going to be an intrusion, meaning that when something is still in virgin state or hasn't received any seed, meaning that the planet itself was just waiting to be intruded upon, for better lack of words, and we are part of that result of the intrusion of that planet. And so this is where people can't really begin to escape in their minds and have a certain problem these days with figuring out that they're not just from space, that they're also from a whole collection of things. And to understand those things is to understand yourself. And that's what the sequence of life really is that you have to know what you were before you know what you're going to become. So the Fibonacci numbers are 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. But what you're really looking at is you're looking at each time, when you know what you were before, you become more next. And you become more and more. So you can see why there's an agenda to stop the human consciousness, the human evolution, knowing everything that happened, knowing what you were connected to, because the more of that you have, you go quantum. And then when you go quantum, of course, nothing can really control you, because you're in more control of your mind because you understand what that really is. And so what we have is we have a situation that's occurred that's peaking. And this is the war that's been going on since the beginning. And so we have to start at the beginning where the war took place, because the war is actually what's a rending, if we want to call it that, a renting, meaning a pulling apart. And the reason why this has to happen is because on a planet that is covered with completely water, and beings that don't live in water seek to live there, they have to pull back the water. So what happens is that what you'll see in the text, or the ancient text about the development of this planet, is that basically there was a planet between Jupiter and Mars. Then there was an encounter with that planet from an entity that they're calling Nibiru, Marduk, Ra, Jupiter, which stems back into many different names that we've isolated. And you will see all of these charts when the post is uploaded. And so what happened from that point is that the planet was known to go into a struggle, that it says that the collision didn't just take place immediately, that the planet actually struggled against this collision and fought. And this became known as the first battle between what they call the Battle of the Dragons. As people see in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, it talks about the dragons beginning to bite their heads off. And what it's really saying is that it's talking about a process that takes place under the microscope with the splitting of life and how new life is developed after that. And so what happened is that in this encounter, our Earth became, well, half of this planet, Tiamat, or at least half, we don't know what the proportion exactly were, and its orbiting satellite, which was known as Kingu, or basically a moon known as Sin, the planet itself erupted, and a piece of that planet became Earth, and the rest of that planet became the asteroid belt and many of the stars that we see, because that was the heavenly part of the planet. Because just as you see with oil and water, the denser parts go down and the more lighter parts go up. And so the denser parts of the composition of this planet, Tiamat, which is all necessary, went lower, while the higher part of that planet went higher. And then the moon was put under control and still allowed to remain in orbit to the larger part of the planet that we now call Earth or Gaia. And that's why for anyone who's doing deep studies into this, they see that Ma'at or Tiamat seems to bear a really close resemblance to Earth, and sometimes people, even myself at times, have confused it for Earth. But the fact is that Tiamat was actually another planet, and then we became this planet called Earth, which is really known as Ki, or next Tierra, before it's ever known as a planet like Earth, which is more of like a language of the more of the Uranus influence on our culture later on. So what happened on this planet Ki is it was completely destabilized on a wobble. And so thus the beings that were living on that planet were always going to be unpolarized. And this is now reflected in why most people use their right hand over their left hand, and there's an extreme non-use of spiritual ability while extreme use of physical ability. And some say that this was even a plan by the being Marduk, Jupiter, Ra, to hit the planet in a certain way where there would be a remaining that they could utilize to resource and to tame, basically. And there was going to be, the rest of it was going to be separated. And that's why we've now become somewhat separated from our star origin. But that's subject to end, and that's what the whole 0-point lineup is really about, is that all of the stars that you can see in the sky, and I saw them the other night, and there's a lot of them, correspond to all the people that and things that exist here. And when the alignment actually happens, you get your full energy, you get your full balance to what you've become. And so this is the best time now to begin to work on yourself, because when this happens, you'll transmute into what you want, your goal. And that's why the society is attempting to have people transmute into the monsters, because that's what the idea of the ones that are attempting to bring the ancient ones back. So we have a few classification of these beings. The eldest ones being called the ancient. Oh, I'm sorry, it's going to confuse even using that term. The oldest ones are called the ancient ones, and it's important to begin to write this kind of stuff down. I'll check and see exactly how much time we have here, but remember, this is a part of a whole series. You will have a post accompanying this, and you can also replay things. But
we have 51 minutes. Sorry.
Okay, great. That's good. So what we have here is that we have a classification of the beings in order for us to get really clear on this, because as we begin to pull this history apart, it's going to get confusing if we don't start designating the beings. And so what I've done is that I've used the terms that are least alike in order to designate the beings. And so the older ones are called ancient ones. The next in line would be the elder gods. The next in line are more or less what we would call Brahmins, or we just call them like the Hindu gods, for better lack of words. But the Brahmins even preceded the Hindu gods, so we just call them Brahmins. And then the next in line were like mains in the Hindu gods. And this is, you can find these beings a lot in the Ahrimanic texts of the Zoroastrian and Persians. And then next in line are actually hybrid demigod kings, which are basically physical people that are physically mated with a god, for better lack of words, half god, half man, or a quarter god, and 75% man, something of this nature. And then that's how the ranks go. And then eventually you get man, and then under that you get demon, and then you keep going down. And so there's an actual list for this, and I'll actually post this list, of all of these stages of consciousness. And so what we have here is we have in the beginning of the planet is that the planet actually was struck to take it off of its 360-degree balance. And then at that point, the planet became vulnerable to an invasion, meaning beings that actually want to come and seize the planet and subdue the planet. From that point, there was an entry into our planet, which we see as a straight line, or a tube, and the planet itself is a circle or sphere. And this is the exact same fractal that you see when a man enters into a woman and his spermatozoa incubates the egg. And so when these beings came to the planet, because they were intending on seeding the planet, the first thing they needed to do is make the planet habitable for seeding. And so the struggle within the mountains, within the waters and the shores being created, are what you're reading when you actually read vividly the war. And so what it is the bending of nature's forces in order to allow it to be habitable for living beings. However, of course, there were other creatures that lived on this planet before this time. And this is where we get to the question of whether or not man existed before these gods got here, or was man created by these gods? And this is a very deep question. So what we have to understand first is that Earth, or Ki as we'll call it, Earth, Ki, had come under several rulerships, especially now at our point, meaning that it's been a constant back and forth going on between brothers and sons, fighting for control over the planet. And in that back and forth, things have gotten very confusing about where things started. So that's why we started with Tiamat first being this planet, then it got blown up. Then a large part of it broke off, and it became Earth. And then Earth, because of that large part that broke off, began to be habitable, especially from where it was positioned after that, which was three clicks from the sun, and which made it perfectly inhabitable. And once the planet was habitable, no telling how much time has transpired in between, more of the Darwinist theories of evolution began to come into play. The simple seeding of life from planets such as Venus. And I have extensive diagrams showing that the pentagram shape within our flower, our fruits, and even our hands and different things are because the incubation or factory, for better lack of words, of the seeds are being ejected from Venus into our environment, just like the Vesica womb shows it's being done. So we're just fractals, and that's why we can't see it on that level. But when we get to larger levels, which we will at 0 point, we'll be able to see it all perfectly. And this, of course, is not something that you have to wait on. You can actually put the body into a 0 point state through meditation, but we won't get off topic now. So what happens is that a planet like Venus, which was known to be a trajection from Jupiter, meaning planets as big as Jupiter can actually build planets that are the size of Venus inside and then traject them just like having a baby. And then that become under more or less that's the sun of Jupiter. And so everyone knows Venus is Lucifer. Lucifer becomes Jupiter. Lucifer becomes the son of Jupiter at this point, and that's shown in the mythology. So injecting this planet Venus next to Earth causes Venus to be more or less a portal to allow the seeding of this planet to take place. And if anyone wants to be concerned about Mars, Mars was actually a planet that was subdued because it was in conjunction with Tiamat. And so the planet Mars was more or less shut down for a moment. And that's why you see the pyramids actually lead to Mars. But we'll get into that later on into this series which is the actual series title is Are You Serious? And that Sirius is spelled like the planet Sirius, where we're going to begin to unveil the cult of the dragon, the cult of the dog, and the cult of the goat, which are the main belief systems of secret societies that are in publication right now. And this gives a complete understanding of these constellations and the beings that are coming from these constellations and how they've been affecting this reality and how to steer oneself around and away from their influences. And so what we have here on the planet is that basically now you have Ki, and Ki is being developed and being seeded. And at this point, there is a development that goes in the Gaelic texts of being called Mil, M-I-L, which is now the ancient term for the first man. And this man is more likened to the pygmy. It's an indigenous man that actually is so symbiotic with nature, he's more or less, and she's more or less very similar to an animal. And this connection, still remember, is not, when I say similar to an animal, the animals had a very deep communication with one another until the cataclysm threw the Earth off of its 300, or Tiamat off of its 360-degree perfection. And that disturbance or schism is what caused the discommunication. So that communication as the planet has attempted to correct its wobble after that, that discommunication has been attempted to be corrected by the original shamanistic indigenous people with nature, and that's why they understand how to communicate with nature more than the hybrid bodies that many are in now, because their lineage has never been tampered with, and so they remain connected through the connection that Tiamat had with all of its species. So what happens from here is that this particular Molan, which is more similar to the next stage of the ape-man, was chosen as the prototype to create a being that was going to be more advanced. And this is why people become confused of whether or not they were originally on Earth or they were created by these star beings. Both. And you can tell that if this is happening, you don't have to take my word for it, you can tell that this is happening if inside you have this inclination that your home is up there somewhere in the sky. And you'll know this because if you look at the animals now, like the cows and the horses and things, if you watch them, even the birds, are very content with being on the planet, especially in certain areas where the planet is more aligned. Like they are not thinking, I want to go to space, because they're home. When a person is thinking, I want to go to space, it's because there's a part in them, like that star origin, as they call it, that is from somewhere else out there. And the interesting part that I uncovered is that this term left-hand path, or left, which is the practice of mysticism and understanding magic and things that turns you on to this magical astrology thing, is the actual term left, meaning that you were left, that your family is not here, that they're gone, they're somewhere else in the stars. And that's why it's important for us now to understand the complete story so that we can come into our next awakening, which is that the new generations that you see here now, the people that are alive, are going to be taking this planet from where it's to go next. If we're continuously going to count on the brothers and the fathers and the sons and the mothers and the daughters from the past that are still fighting with each other across time, or at least making us think that, then we'll never learn the lesson of what all this was really about, which is, why would you mix people from the moon with people from the sun? It could be as simple as just interpreting it as that. Why would you put two beings that are completely contrary to each other together? And then watch all the drama that ensues from that point. The confusion that goes on within the being, when it sees nature being hurt, so it wants to gravitate towards nature, and then it sees spirits being hurt, so it wants to gravitate towards spirits, but then the spirit seen separate from the nature, just as the water is separate from the fire, and then the sky is separate from the earth. And so there is this division that exists. There's a boundary that's there that's stronger than what we perceive it may be at times, meaning that there's a boundary in between us and this higher level of things. And we're working on removing that boundary at the right time the boundary needs to be removed. Meaning that the time the boundary needs to be removed, everyone's agreeing ASAP. But we understand to remove the boundary means that, one, it will be let into open space, meaning that anything you think will happen. And I've witnessed this in my personal life. But the interesting thing about this is, especially when you're moving fast, when you think the wrong thing, the repercussions for that thing happens fast. And so now you'll get a little insight about the troubles of the gods. And just as it says in the Bhagavad Gita, we give you these stories of the gods so you can understand they make the same mistakes as man. True enough, the gods are men. So what we're talking about is we're talking about what's really happened here, the pros and the cons of it, and knowing that anytime you get into something this deep as what we're experiencing on this reality, there's going to be some things that you're looking at that don't seem to be very nice. And what you'll also notice is, as I say here in the beginning of this post, when looking into a womb, expect to see darkness. Meaning that when you're looking into the deeper parts of the origins of things, it's just like looking into a womb, a physical womb, and the darkness that's there, and life is at another stage. So if you don't have the right way of interpreting what you're looking at, you'll get all of the stories that we have right now that are confusing people about what's really going on in the spiritual plane. But there are those that are not confused about it. And this is what this conversation is also about, is that there are a group of individuals that know all of what I'm going to explain to you. And every single day that we spend learning it, they spend continuously accomplishing their agenda, which is to bring, during the lineup, to open up gates to bring these ancient beings back into the dimension, while people that are unprepared are still on the dimension. And so this alleviates asking the question of whether the ancient ones are good or bad. Because many people are now actually practicing the religions and the rites of the ancient ones, which include Ra and include many of the other beings. And because they feel like personally that the current ruler, which would be somewhat concerned, would be concluded as Satan and Lucifer and those beings which are not as separate as many people think, just as Santa and Satan and Saturn and the saints are all the same. They will see that there's still this constant turning over of power. And so what I want to do is one more time is I'm going to take another brief moment to take a breather. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to take to the lines for a moment, because the whole goal of today's show is not even to get really into this, because it needs a supporting post. It needs the pictures that I'm going to show about all of what I'm explaining right now. And that's why today's show was really more about the introduction of what we're going to talk about. And it's also a great time to ask me any type of question, because I do have this excessive amount of knowledge these days, and it's expanding more upon what we've all learned in all of our practices, whether it's meditation, chakras, crystals, whether it's esoteric knowledge, gods, planets, universal languages, you name it, frequencies, I got it. So the thing is that I wanted this to be the beginning of the introduction to this new me, and I think that everyone can afford a transmutation process. And each time we cannot hold each other back from making that transmutation. And so my transmutation is more of universal now. It's more of actually getting into the meat of things, closing the books on certain things, like case closed. We know what happened. We know who was involved. Aryans went to war with the pharaohs, and I'm going to show you exactly what the repercussions of that was. I'm going to show you why we're so confused and keep fighting with each other. I'm going to show you why we're going to stop fighting, and how we're going to get together as a complete society, not black or white. As I say, this reality is very interesting to me, because we see everything in color except for each other. We still see each other as he's either black or he's either white, or she's black or she's white. And so now the resistance is shown an awesome example of putting people together from all around the world, and that's serious. Like when you look at the actual site and you see the names of the countries that people are from and the members, and you really get the actual mission of what's taking place here, which is we're going to actually learn all the knowledge. We're not going to choose a side. We're going to stringe the knowledge for the most valuable parts of it. And then we're going to develop something that allows the youth of this world, and just the people who are here, even the animals and everything else that's alive, to get to a higher level of comprehension about their experience. Because whatever the reality was supposed to be, what the actuality is now going to become, is Earth is a storehouse of information, because the gods left it here. And I'll explain more of that when we get into the next segment of this whole show. And so I'm going to allow Satori to give me a brief update of what exactly is going on the line and what's happening in the chat box, if anything.
in the chat boxes, there are no questions being posted, but I do have a caller that's been really patient that was been on from the beginning trying to ask a question. So I'm going to try to see if the person's still available, so just give me one moment, okay? Okay, caller 505.
Hello, this is
Are you there?
Nima. Yeah, this is Nima. I really don't have a question, but I was also, I kind of spawned in my mind with the last few things that Sevan said and was wondering how much a lot of this had to do with a mentee.
Okay. I can go ahead and start talking a little bit about Egypt. Basically, what we understand now is that the planet, as you see now, you see in every single text, the planet, because of that, coming off of 360 degrees, was always subject to destabilization, meaning that if the frequency of the people slowed down or became unbalanced on the planet for whatever reason, then the whole planet would come off of balance and it would flood many of the areas. And so to keep the progress continuing with the whole process that we're in here, which is more or less the evolution of the species. This is what they're giving it as a term, an idea of continuously making a smarter and a smarter creation. But the problem with that is when you're on a planet that erases everything at a certain point in time because there's no one really alive to tell that knowledge anymore, then they started to make time capsules, for better lack of words. And the mentee is one of those hyperdimensional time capsules, which is basically a place where knowledge is stored. So what would generally happen is that the places like where the pyramid is are geologically positioned that no matter what really takes place, if the life is completely wiped out on a planet, well, not even completely, but the majority of life is wiped out, when you get to that area, you'll still see a head poking out of the sand. And then the next endeavor for the people who see the head poking out of the sand is we got to eventually dig to see what else that head really is. And that's how you end up uncovering all of what's in that area, when you can finally get to the technological level to be able to do that, or at least the population to be able to do that. And then you find at that point the halls, which contain the information from what you're really looking at is you're looking at more of the Anunnaki, the Anunnaki's involvement on the planet, which are also the fallen ones, the Reptilians, the giants, the Anakim, the sons of Anu, those who fell from the sky. And so in their relationship with our planet and why the British people or the people over in that area became the custodians or the servants of those gods. So many people are confused in believing that the Anunnaki gods were actually Europeans, and that's by far true, especially when you look at the pictures of Nimrod, the tribe of Ham, any of these individuals during that time, or just the Anunnaki gods altogether, because they were known to come from the sun, and Ra was known to come from the sun also. But what you had is actually a skirmish within those parties. And when that skirmish took place, it took place for exactly what these people are now accepting, which is that there was a hybridizing that took place in the Garden of Eden, which Eden means somewhat of wasteland. It doesn't mean like this is like a pure, beautiful, pristine place. This means that you're actually in the center of a desert where an experiment is taking place, this Garden of Eden. And this Garden of Eden was an attempt by a particular faction of these Anunnakis, or these Nephilim Rephaim, that were attempting to breed and make workers and things of that nature, and which is something that they learned from their God. So the thing is that when you continue to trace back history, you see that history does repeat itself, that individuals have left one yoke to only take on another. They've removed, they've complained about the enslavement only when they get free to enslave someone else. And because of the abuse, it's like the same thing that happens psychologically when a person is abused, and so the moment they get a chance to go and abuse something, they do. And that's what I started noticing really about all of our existence is our body is a map to the cosmos. Our thought process is the actual knowledge of everything that happened on this planet, like how we even think, how we look at people, all the processes that we're going through when we're growing up, for better lack of words, is where this planet is at a certain stage. It's just a larger stage. And so this larger stage is accompanied with people actually stepping up and helping everyone make the transition. And I think that's really a big thing, only from the fact that it's difficult for a person to accept that role when they don't know a lot of the information that's going on, because they just haven't. Like me personally, I've always felt uncomfortable with being asked questions that I don't know the answers to. And so that sparked me to actually learn a lot of the knowledge and then to touch things that you couldn't put down once you got it in your mind. Meaning that this level of knowledge that we're actually experiencing right now and what we're ingesting and reading as a dimension is not something that we can really turn away from, because it echoes across time. But it is important for us to know, and echoes across space, what I'm saying. Meaning that these stories have star origins to them now. And that's why we don't have much knowledge about the ancient ones on Tiamat, because that didn't happen on Earth. Their story didn't begin here. Their story began out in the stars. We only have that they were attacked by the being that's actually ruling our planet, and we have that those beings were bad and evil and needed to be put under control. But what it's really saying is that we have to keep this planet in check in nature, because it will overrun anything trying to live on it if it's not symbiotic with it. And you can see that. Like the planet will, if man wasn't exercising his force over this planet would have grown over and the animals would have attacked. But the thing is that man becomes and woman become the tamer. They tamed these beasts. They domesticated these beasts. And so while everyone wants to, in the reality, and this is where we have to start accepting certain things so that we can move on, while everyone wants to, in the reality, wants to claim abuse, they don't see they're abusing and repeating the same steps. And we can lighten up on some of this abuse. Some of this abuse is so tied into us that it's going to be a step for us to get rid of it, meaning a step for us to stop eating altogether and become breatharians. Is a big step. I'm not even there yet. But we can make a step at stop eating things with blood in it, because the blood is contaminated. It just is. So any stories about you could eat meat and you need meat and things, you need protein. But when you go into another animal's flesh and that animal's consciousness is lower than yours, you can already understand what's going to happen after that. So I think we got, I'm sure we answered the Minty questions. Nima, is there anything else that you wanted to ask, brother?
No, I'll wait for the time, because there's more to go into with the Minty and the DNA and these upcoming times. But thank you for your time, Sevan.
Okay, no problem. And actually, I'll go into a little bit more of these upcoming times by reading a couple of things I excerpted out of some very deep books that I've obtained. And this is also how I've been upgrading my knowledge and filling in a lot of the pieces to the puzzle, because I've had this feeling that there's stall tactics taking place. Like the whole thing with TV and the movies and all that stuff are just like stall tactics. So I've been wondering, what are they waiting on? And of course, I have a plethora of knowledge and reasons, but I just knew that none of those knowledge and that reasoning was really fulfilling my question. And so what I understand now is they're waiting on is the lineup, because the lineup for anyone gives them the ability to channel themselves or anything else that they could actually what's called signature. Let me get the exact post here. But what this basically means is it's going on now, and I have a lot of footage to show you, but it's basically when a higher vibratory frequency being actually takes over the body of a lower vibratory frequency being. And I have this lady, and everyone's pretty much familiar with her, I just don't have her name, but she's talking about this Pleiadian man that's entered her body, and he's like working her computer and instructing her how to do different things, and you can clearly tell she's not lying. And this is actually taking place on multiple parts of the dimension from these star beings, for better lack of words. And because people are not in tune with their own star, meaning that the chakra centers correspond to the connections to other things, mainly the planets. So closed chakras or closed portals have been sent
information, and we've been pondering over the chakra center and its use for a prolonged period of time. And what it came down to is that the chakras are interface points and are often geometrically configured to the planetary bodies, and that they serve as gates for us to go into those spheres, but then they also serve as gates as things for those spheres to come into us, and that there was a proper method of how to lock the gate from the inside. And this actually, and we're kind of getting a little off the original topic of what I was going to read to you, but this, I guess, is far more important. This corresponds also to, actually, and leads back into this whole thing with the gates, is that basically with the body, or what happened with the earth was, is that once this Ra, Jupiter, Marduk, just name all the names here because I have all the names written down to include in the post. We have Jupiter, Ra, Nibiru, Marduk, Jesus, Bel, Deuce, Indra, Jove, the son of Saturn, had an earth mother, divine father from the tribe of Judah, split the earth. Okay? So this is basically a being who already understands how to use his astral body, very advanced, and take physical form, and was birthed by something that was by a earth mother, original earth mother, and a divine father, or father from the stars. So in this case, hold up for a brief moment.
Caller, you still there?
Yeah, I'm actually I'm grabbing another list of names here, but what I kind of almost lost my train of thought in reading all those names and exactly where I was at.
Talking about the closed chakras, the closed portals, interface.
Okay, there we go. I do appreciate all the assistance I can get for anyone that's willing to remind me at times, because again, it's like transition of the mind. And I wanted to say I have Carlos in the studio, and I have Mr. Spirit Matter here in the studio with us too, and that's Pablo, and he came down from Miami to check us out here in beautiful Costa Rica. So moving right along, what happened was that Marduk basically locked the gates when the being that's here now running Earth got here. In order to keep the beings that were pursuing it from getting into the dimension, it destroyed the gate. And so this begins to remind you of Stargate, the actual series. But it's actually in the ancient books that Marduk destroyed the gate from the inside. And so what happens is on these holidays that we know as the Satanic holidays, that the dimensions are the closest together into the center, because the center is the only connecting point of all realities. And I want you to vision in your mind reality as concentric circles, continuous circles and circles and circles and circles, and each circle is a plane. But the only thing that all of those planes have in common is the center. So also, brother, the center is now noted as a Amenti, and that was the hall that led deep down into the center of the earth, and then that center gets you connected with all the subsequent concentric circles. Because remember, when you're looking at these circles, one's bigger than another, one's bigger than another, one's bigger than another, and it keeps going, but the centers are still the same, and that's how the planes are separated, and that's where the planes come together. And so what happens is that because Earth is on a wobble, there's been a struggle by the left-hand path, mainly, and the people who practice into the occult, to make contact with the center of consciousness, for better lack of words. And that is subsequent to be corrected when this 2012 happens, which is where the wobble itself that's taking place on this planet actually stands up on its point. So it would be more like, even if you're dealing with something that's not exactly symmetric or symmetrically perfect, there's still a perfect point for it to kind of line up. That's going to happen. And so at that point, that's why I'm encouraging people to not choose sides with these factions of what I've noted is basically... I'm pulling my list of names here again. You have An, who's denoting itself as the father and mother, because it's an A and an N. Then you have Leviathan, which is the serpent energy of the earth, which is really a generalized term. Then you have Corazon, which is the abyss,
But now all these names have been enacted as energies and have gotten disturbed because of man's unbalanced consciousness and woman's unbalanced consciousness. You have Saturn, Satan, who's Ansar, who's Adar. Saturn just means the serpent star. And the names it goes by is also Eritron and Ninib. You have Jupiter, which we just named off. We have Enlil. We have Aya, who's the Tetragrammaton. YHVH, Yahweh, Jehovah, Adonai, Enki, Yaldabaoth, all the same being, who actually spliced its DNA with the ape man, which is really the missing link, as they keep calling it. This is the missing link in spirituality, is that the abomination was, as it's called by this God, their father, for better lack of words. The abomination was the abominable snowman, for better lack of words. What this means is the mixing of the star god's DNA with the human man, the ape man. And the abomination that it caused because it produced the albino. And they reside in Albion, which is the name of Britain, and they were albino giants. So I know people don't really want to talk about that kind of stuff, but the problem is the lies are going a little too far. And people's cultures are being hijacked, and then everyone is kind of confused like they just came out of the Tower of Babel. And what's happened to me personally is that I've been able to stand on the Kether or stand on a higher level of consciousness and just examine what's going on and put it all together in the language that's spoken, which is first starts off with the English language from an etymology standpoint, because it's the language of the slave. So at that point, you at least get a chance to learn who the gods are. This is also the process of most people when they're going through religion. They're meeting the gods. Sometimes they end up staying lifetimes before they realize the real agenda of the god. Because oftentimes, remember, the gods don't allow their servants to know the high knowledge. That's always the, for better lack of word, stilo of the god. And so what that's caused is that the people are generally blindly worshiping for a prolonged period of time. And when that occurs over generation after generation after generation, ideas of anything beyond what that God was doing are sometimes bred out of the individual. But we're not animals completely. So what our origins of greatness cannot be completely bred out of us because we have origins that are greater than what they're alluding to. And so I'm rounding the corner here on this show. I'm going to check exactly how much time we do have left on the clock before I get into some more of this. Now remember, the reason why I'm skirting around this conversation, for better lack of words, and not really getting deep into any of these subjects that we're covering is you're going to need to see the photos, and you're going to need to see the videos, you're going to need to see the posts in order for you to believe it. Because when they say you can't handle the truth, this is exactly what they're referring to 100%. And so I'm going to take this moment for you to update me on where we're exactly at on time, and if there's any questions before I get into the next part.
Okay, thank you so much, Sevan, and thank you, caller, for calling in. Basically we have 15 minutes remaining on the show, and I do have a question on the Resistance chat box. To get back on the alien interview, they would like to know your thoughts on the alien corporations that allegedly created light beings or souls. So they just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Non-valid. To create the soul is still where they're hazy. Because the fact of the matter is the soul belongs to the totality. It belongs to all there is, the nameless God, as they love to call it. It's the Elohim of the Elohim, as they call it, the God of the gods. So what happens is that when and this is how they started to demark this. And this is a very important question because it's actually it gives us our strength or it gives us our weakness. What started to happen in these times that I'm telling you about during the Gitas and the Puranas and the Persian times and everything is that the gods had convinced everyone at that point that the spirit that was inside of them was the gods. And if the gods happened to pull their spirit out of that person, then that person would die. And to prove this, the gods often killed people to prove to to the other people that are of course a lot more primitive, hey, the God can remove the life from an individual. So what happened is that there's a heavy belief after a while that all of what we were the gods, and that if we somehow stopped worshiping the gods, then all of our energy would be gone and we would not be able to function. So you can see where that ends up going with, wanting to please the God more, which is when you start to do even more for this God to get more of this power that you're saying only comes from this God. And so basically the spirit and the matter of the spirit started getting confused, more or less. It was really where there were different degrees of the spirit. And that's why in the book it says, try the spirits, to see basically which one you're dealing with. The spirit that's actually in the animal is not the same as the spirit from a being from Uranus. It's not. So the thing is that for someone to say, oh, I created spirits, then they have to produce way more evidence of that than this dimension has to offer in its deepest level of thought. In its deepest level or its deepest cabals, which are Nazi cabals. It's NASA. It's NAS. As they call it, the NAS. So this Nazi movement. Now remember, the Nazis were coming across as Aryans, but the Aryans were the Hindu gods. So people have to ask themselves, well, how did the Nazis get confused with the Aryans? And that's because the Aryan god, which is much later in the story, like we're still back at the ancient ones and the elder gods. The Aryans, and then we haven't got to the Titans and the Olympians. The Aryans come around that phase. And so with these Aryans, they started, because of course there was a removal of knowledge from the planet. There's always a removal of knowledge from the planet. It's literally, when I look through time, all I see is that the knowledge gets uncovered, then someone blows everyone up with it, and then it starts all over. And when I started watching the succession of that, I started learning that the way to graduate is to learn how to manage your power correctly. And this is also even a test that's coming to us on a light level, is are we taking our power to use to attract lovers and basically do a bunch of stuff that's going to end up keeping us here longer? Or are we using that to help people get out of here? Because that's how we're going to get out of here. What I started realizing is that my symbiotic relationship with everyone that I'm in contact with is that it was very deep. But the fact is that, one, I wouldn't even have gotten this far if the resistance wasn't here, because I would have just kind of backed off of telling everyone, or no one, because there would have been no one there, and I would just kept all the information in my mind and just been alienated. And that's why they're saying when you're going through certain kinds of information, that information will affect you in a certain kind of way, so you have to be careful of that. It doesn't mean that you don't have to learn it, but it just means you need to be on the kether a lot. Don't be in the planet. So what I mean is that if you're learning Martian knowledge, Mercury or Hermetic knowledge, Saturnalian, reclusive knowledge, you name it, Neptune or Jovian, love, tantric, all of that, when you need to be able to pull yourself out of that planet and that system on cue, because you'll get stranded in that planet on the system, in your mind. And getting stuck in Saturn, for better lack of words, which is where the world is now. It's actually going through its Saturnalian cycle, which is the bringer of the new age. Because remember, the new age means the end of the old age. And the old age has to kind of be destroyed. And so Saturn's kind of a symbol for the destruction and renewal. And so it depends on how a person is rubbing Saturnalian concepts determine what direction they're going to be on the Skype. Because the Skype cuts the cords of the dependencies. It's like it's like how we get cut from our mother's umbilical. Saturn supposedly is responsible for cutting our umbilical from the Earth, or the Earth tether, as they call it. And this gets us into the higher state of consciousness because we can't be dependent on our previous system. And so, again, moving through the knowledge as you're moving through spheres and systems of thought, and being able to stand outside of those systems and thought are the key to making sure your knowledge doesn't become stagnant, but also that you don't become completely consumed by the planet's knowledge. Because there's a clip-off to every planet, meaning that there's a drawback to every single planet in learning that knowledge. And, of course, with Saturnalian period is the extremely reclusive cycle, meaning that if a person gets too deep into the instructions that are coming through that society,
especially the ones that have become very intelligent, because Saturn is also time and wisdom, they start to pull away from society altogether and recluse themselves. Actually, I see two opposing forces on this planet, being between Jupiter and Saturn, and then, of course, Venus being, or the feminine aspect, not even being able to be narrowed down to just a planet, but more or less filling all things. But between the Saturn and the Jupiter concepts, I believe what happens is that a person needs to understand how to even balance those energies, because you have to have the love, and you have to have the sternness, and you have to have all of what you've learned here on Earth in order to be able to comprehend the next sphere and how to move about that sphere easily. Because what happens generally with us is because the physical plane takes an extremely large amount of energy to move through. And that's why if you're looking for a physical manifestation, an actual physical being appearing in front of you on this dimension when you're doing your meditations or whatever, you can forget about it in certain senses when it comes to energy, because any higher being is not going to waste their energy coming into lower planes. There's other ways that they communicate, mainly through the mind, as they say in a lot of the deeper Chaldean texts, is that the interface between one's mind and the grand being is only in the mind. It doesn't exist anywhere else because it can't manifest itself in the material world except by sign and symbol. And so what we find is that these synchronistic numbers, if anyone's starting to see numbers, and now I do have more of a reference to interpreting what those numbers mean, like even numbers like 9/11 and different numbers, now I see exactly what they mean. And that is according to their true Kabbalistic value. And so now that I'm able to see that, I can see exactly what a number means and what exactly it's conveying. And so there will be, of course, much more of that knowledge released. And that's what I was saying in the beginning of the show, is that we're opening up a whole new segment. We're opening now the University of the world, and this is the first course. And this is only the introduction. And so yeah, that's really where we're at. And so as far as these aliens saying that they're creating human souls, try again. I mean, the Jedi mind trick doesn't work on us. The soul is infinite, and to create one and to say that you created it is just part of the problem here.
Most definitely, Sevan. Thank you so much for answering that question. And I have another one on the Blog Talk Radio chat box, and they're being asked there is, what is the ultimate reason for the hybridization of species and energies? And what do you think happens at the top of the energetic food chain?
Okay, because we only have, I believe, 5 minutes left.
Yeah,
correct?
I mean, we have like 5 minutes.
Well,
if you want to cover it.
Let me just answer the question really briefly. Just answer the first part of that question one more time.
The first part was, what is the ultimate reason of hybridization of the species and energies?
Okay, let me just explain that, and then because the other one is going to take me way too long to explain.
Okay.
For the hybridization of the species is actually the experience. What happens is that even the animals, the plants, even everything under on the microscopic level is all having an experience right now. And that experience leads to another experience, leads to another experience, leads to another experience. So it's been already deemed that the more diversity, notice the word, the more diversity that you actually have in a species, the more realities continue to spawn off of that. And the actual collision point, which we look at in Tiamat and Marduk, and the off balance for a while, is actually what happens when two separate species meet each other, even under the microscope. But as they begin to correct themselves, like if we can correct, and when we correct what we have going on with each other in our hatred towards each other, with the thoughts and the ideas of understanding your father as your conqueror at times, and how to come in terms with those type of things through facts, and not omitting certain things because you're being biased or selective about how you're perceiving the information, but just perceive it as fact. What is as fact? And so that's really, and to answer the question, what do I know is on the top of that? You don't. That's what makes this whole thing so interesting, because if anyone can tell you they know what's on the top, oh man, cut it out. If you knew even words that were correlated with the top, you wouldn't be here. That's the end of it. The vibrations of the understanding are what begin to create who we are. Ideas start in the ether and then manifest in this realm. We were an idea first that actually came to pass. and we're learning how to do the same thing. And so, a lot of the words that we're using right now even hold deeper meanings to what exactly I'm saying. And as people begin to play it over again, they'll hear what's going on between the lines. And what I'm really saying to everyone is that we have something definitely to do here, and we're doing it. And the next level of knowledge is going to take people into understanding everything that they've wanted to know, and understanding, outerstanding, and all of that, on what they can do to actually get themselves in tune with what's about to happen. But really know that most assured it will not delay, meaning that whether a person gets in tune with it or not is going to determine where they're actually going to be at in the whole thing. And so it is still their responsibility to understand whether it's going to be descension time or ascension time. And I recommend a person get their vibratory frequency as high as possible, and that's why I've introduced the monatomics as something that everyone could enjoy. $29.99 a bottle for 60 caps. Get it in your system, study, begin to detoxify your system with the things that have been applied, because what people are not realizing, and this is the last thing I have to say, is that next year is the lineup. This year is already showing to bring the energies associated with what happens when people start to connect with their star origins. So now the thing is that you need to know who you are and not become anything or anyone else. That's it. So I wanted to send wholeness and balance again to everyone. I'm going to let Satori go ahead and take us to the next segment, which is the end of the show. And also, I just want to let everyone know we'll have that post up by somewhere around Wednesday. It's very expansive, but definitely going to allow a person to gain a lot of knowledge. And we'll even have it in Espanol.
Thank you, Sevan. Thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you to Carlos and Pablo over there, Mr. Spirit Matter. And, yeah, if anyone wants to check out the post, you have to come on to the Resistance website, and that is www.resistance2010.com. And I just want to say wholeness and balance vibrations to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on today's show. And the show series are No More Secrets. It's a 9-series show. And the next one will be They Came from the Sea. So I just want to tell everyone, till then, stay awake.